Welcome, Greenhill. Thank you very much for being here today for part of our Living History series. When you guys came down to the ramp there to the 7th floor, did you see the big photo mosaic on the wall, the pictures of John and Jackie Kennedy and all the thousands of little pictures? Well, our speaker today was one of those photographers who took a number of those pictures of the Kennedys during their visit to Dallas on November 22nd, 1963. This is Eamon Kennedy. He was a photographer with the Dallas Times Herald in 1963, and he's got a really remarkable story to tell us today. He was at the airport when President Kennedy arrived. He was also at the hospital when President Kennedy died, and he covered the trial of Jack Ruby, the man who shot Lee Harvey Oswald on the Sunday following the assassination. So please join me in welcoming Eamon Kennedy to tell his story today. Eamon, let's start off by taking a look at you from 1963. There you are. Now, your name is Eamon Kennedy, and you were born in Ireland, which is connected to President Kennedy. In fact, what was your father's name?
John Fitzgerald Kennedy.
Yeah, not the John Fitzgerald Kennedy, but his father's name was John Fitzgerald Kennedy. And through some genealogy research that a family member did, you are fourth cousins to President Kennedy?
Well, fourth cousins to the Rose Kennedy, the mother.
Okay.
So I'm not sure how that relates.
But if you look at the picture of Eamon Kennedy from 1963, you can see that there really is something of a resemblance to President Kennedy, particularly that sweeping mane of hair that Eamon had then and still has to this day. Now, Eamon, we're looking at a wonderful picture of President Kennedy that you took on November 22nd, but this wasn't the first time you covered Kennedy. You actually covered him working in Canada. Tell us about that.
I did. Well, this particular picture was probably the last portrait of President Kennedy, because I took that right before he got in the limo. And he was walking towards me, and I told him to hold it. I didn't want him moving, so he stopped for just an instant, and I was able to get that picture. But as far as I know, it's the last close-up before he got shot. Mm-hmm. But I did cover Kennedy in a state visit to Ottawa. I covered Canadian affairs for a whole bunch of periodicals, mostly Time magazine, and some Canadian newspapers and magazines. But his visit to Canada I covered and got some nice pictures there too.
Now, President Kennedy was the first president born in the 20th century. He was the youngest president ever elected, and his predecessor, Dwight Eisenhower, was the oldest president in American history. So a very stark contrast between the elderly Dwight Eisenhower and the more youthful, robust John F. Kennedy. As a young man, as a young professional photographer, what did this mean to you, having this transition from Eisenhower to Kennedy?
Well, I never photographed Eisenhower, so it's hard to make that basis on a one-to-one basis. But Kennedy exuded youthfulness and energy, and he had a great presence about him.
You were a Kennedy fan?
I was, yeah. Absolutely.
Now, tell us how you ended up being born in Ireland, growing up in London, working in Canada. How did you end up in Dallas, Texas?
It was really accidental. I was, when I left Canada, I was in the West Indies for a while, and when I came back, I landed in Miami, and I applied for a job on the Miami Herald. And they didn't have an opening at the time, but they were interested, so I decided to go to San Francisco, and I took a bus in Miami, not realizing how far it was. And after 2 days, I need to get off the bus, and I asked the driver, I said, where's the next reasonable sized city? He said, we'll be in Dallas in 3 hours. So I said, my ticket, if I get off the bus for a couple of days, can I continue? He said, yeah, the ticket's fine. So I got off the bus, and I hung out at the newspapers. I went to Dallas Morning News, and they actually drove me over to the Times Herald and said, go check with these guys. So I was there for 2 or 3 days, and the newspaper hired me to be on the staff. And in fact, the chief photographer's wife, who was also a staff photographer, she quit so as I could get the job. I didn't know that until later, but that's how I ended up in Dallas. It was accidental.
So you just stopped the bus?
I stopped to rest up before I went on with the trip.
And you never left, which is fantastic because you were able to take the wonderful pictures we're going to see today. We've looked at this picture. So November 22nd, 1963, President Kennedy is visiting Dallas. Were you concerned at all about his safety? Because Dallas was not particularly supportive of Kennedy as a whole. What did you think?
Well, there's always, when you're covering these events, there's always in the back of your mind, there's always a thought something can go wrong. And although, I think the whole staff was very excited about covering a presidential visit, it's not something that happens all the time. And but the morning started out kind of dreary. It looked like it was going to rain. And strangely enough, if it rained, he probably wouldn't have got shot because they would have had the top up on the car. But right as the plane landed, Love Field, Air Force One, the sun broke out, and it was really nice. And
now, what was your official assignment that day?
Well, myself and a reporter were covering the arrival at Love Field, and then because he wasn't going to be gone long, like an hour and a half, going to make a speech and then come back. We're going to cover the departure. So after we covered the arrival and he left, we went up to, at Love Field at the time, I think it was a Polynesian restaurant. We decided to have some lunch. And we just sat down, and the waitress told us that the president had been shot. She'd heard it on the radio. This is before there was any there was no iPhones then. There was no cell phones of any kind. And in fact, you had to dial a rotary telephone to make a call. It was before there was buttons. So we both left instantly for Parkland. And
well, before we get to Parkland, let's take a look at some of the pictures you took at Love Field. This is the Kennedys as they're greeting local officials here. And then the Kennedys, rather than going from the plane directly into the limousine, they actually walked over to the fence and
they got into the crowd.
Shaking hands. Did you know that they were going to do this?
No.
Okay. Now, this picture, well, let me go back to the one right before this, because if you look at the shadows towards the bottom of the picture, you can actually see Eamon Kennedy's hands there holding his camera. You can see a shadow of his hands there holding up the camera. Now, in a crowd like this, is that what you would do? How would you take a picture like this? You would just hold your camera up?
Yeah, because, see, if you shoot from eye level on this shot, the guy that's in front of them will have blocked the view. So you have to hold the camera high and shoot and judge exactly how to frame it without looking through a viewfinder. And the main thing on this kind of an event is running out of film. So you just can't shoot indiscriminately. You have to kind of ration yourself because it takes so long to reload a camera that the event's over by the time you got to reload it. So.
Yeah, this wasn't digital photography.
No,
you actually had to load a roll of film.
It's 36 exposures, and we normally carry 2 or 3 cameras, but if you run out of film, you're left out in the cold because the event's still happening while you're trying to reload film. So you have to ration yourself on how much film you're going to use on each situation.
Now, a picture like this is really remarkable because it's such a great photograph, and to think that you took this picture with your hands held up over your head,
right,
not even really aiming and framing the shot. You just sort of did the best you could.
Well, you use it with wide-angle lens. You pre-focus the camera, and you figured out the exposure because none of this stuff was automatic. You had to focus the lens by hand. It wasn't autofocus, and you had to set the shutter speed and the aperture. And it was very important where you set the focus because, if it's set too far, they'll be blurred. If it's too close, they'll be blurred. It has to be set exactly right.
Now, to take a picture like this from up overhead, and we'll compare it with one you took at eye level, I'm guessing. This is probably one you took looking through the viewfinder?
Right.
Okay. Now, in a picture like this, with so much activity, the Kennedys are moving, people are reaching their hands out. As a photographer, as someone who's trying to tell a story through pictures, what are you looking for?
Basically, you're looking for the interaction between the subject and the crowd. And at the same time, you're trying to stay out of the way of the Secret Service, because they tend to push everyone out of the way. So and it's a matter of being able to walk backwards and still keep shooting and not fall over. And, it's a delicate balancing act.
And there's other photographers there, too, trying to cover the exact same thing you are.
Exactly, yeah.
Now, give us a sense. You're the only person in this room who actually saw the president in person. What did he look like in person as compared to these black and white news pictures or black and white television?
He was very dynamic in person. He was a little shorter than I thought he would be, because you always imagine people have been a little taller, but he was slightly shorter than I thought he would be. And Jackie Kennedy was a little taller than I thought she was, but he was very charming. He had a lot of charisma and energy, and it certainly exhibited itself in the way he interacted with people.
So we're going to go from a scene of joy and happiness like this to a scene that's very different. I'll get your water down here. Now, this is the crowd outside of the emergency room at Parkland Hospital waiting for word on the president's condition. So very different from the previous picture you took. You were at Parkland, or excuse me, you were at Love Field having lunch. You said you found out about the shooting?
We never did get lunch.
Oh.
Because we haven't even ordered when we found out that we needed to be somewhere else. Lunch became very unimportant. We drove very fast. We were probably, myself and the reporter, Bob Fenley, were the first, I think we were the first people to get to Parkland. Because it's a very short hop from Love Field to Parkland. Mm-hmm. And we tried to get inside, but we were not successful. I did get the shot of, there's another shot somewhere showing Jackie Kennedy with the blood-spattered dress.
We'll get to that in a moment.
We did try to get inside. They wouldn't let us in. Mm-hmm. So besides the ambulance and departure of that, the only other opportunity for pictures was the reaction of the crowd. Mm-hmm. And although I did get probably the first picture of Lyndon Johnson coming out a side door, with several Secret Service people.
So this is the crowd outside waiting, and we've got a unique picture to show you next. This next picture Mr. Kennedy did not take because he's in it. And this right here, I'll show you, there is Eamon Kennedy right there, waiting outside Parkland Hospital. And Eamon, we can see you've got 2 cameras around your neck, and I also want to mention you're standing next to 2 of your fellow photographers. This is John Mazziota, who was your boss, the chief photographer, right. And then another staff photographer, Bob Jackson. And remember Bob, because we'll mention him again in a little bit when we talk about the day Oswald was shot. But now we can see in these pictures that all 3 of you have 2 cameras around your necks. And that was just because when you would run out of film in one camera, you always wanted to have a second one ready to go?
Well, that's partly right. Also, it would be 2 different lenses. One would be more wide angle than the other, mm-hmm. So it's very hard to carry enough equipment and still be able to move in these situations. But if you took everything you thought you'd need, you'd have to have two helpers to carry it all, because if you weigh yourself down with too much stuff, you just can't move fast enough. So.
And we see you're wearing that trench coat because, as you said, it was sort of a drizzly morning that day.
It was supposed to be raining.
Yeah. And then after the announcement of the president's death, you turned your camera on the crowd and you captured some of the most haunting images of people responding, reacting to news that the president died. We see these two ladies here. Do you remember anything in particular about these two women you photographed?
No, they were just crying.
Okay. But this next picture is one that really became sort of your signature picture from that weekend. You captured this picture of a little girl who turned out to be named Kathi Atkinson, praying, and you can see there's actually tears in her eyes starting to run down her cheeks. Tell us about this picture. You only took one shot of her.
It was just one frame. And, you know, when people look at pictures and when they look at newspapers, you tend to read things from left to right. And luckily she was looking in that direction, because if she was looking in the other direction, the picture would have been less dynamic, because you would go off the page. But when looking in that direction, your eyes stop on the picture. If she was facing the other way, I don't think the picture would have been as successful. And I don't know why I only took one frame, but things were happening fast, and I wanted to save film for other things.
Now, this picture ended up the next day on the front page, and there we have it, front page of the Dallas Times Herald. Now, Eamon, speaking to a younger audience here, give us a sense of how that picture would go from the film in your camera to the front page of a newspaper. What's the process there?
Well, you know, after you've shot on film and you reload the film back into the cassette, you got to go in the dark room. And I'm talking about totally dark, no light whatsoever. You load it on a stainless steel reel, you process the film, developer, stop back, fixer. And it's got to be washed, squeegeed, and dried. And then you can print it. But sometimes you got to do this in a big hurry, because depending on the deadline of the newspaper, we'd often print negatives wet because we had no time to dry them. But this particular picture ran pretty well on the front page of every newspaper around the world. And it became quite famous. It took on a life of its own.
And when you took that picture, you didn't know who that little girl was.
I had no idea. And normally you're supposed to get names, but it was all happening so fast I didn't have time for names, you know.
But you found out who it was, Kathi Atkinson, and here's a picture of you and Kathi with the newspaper. How did she feel about this moment of fame, you capturing this sort of spontaneous picture at Parkland?
Well, actually, she went on to become quite famous because of that picture, and wrote a book, and was a well situated speaker. She gave a lot of lectures, and was honored by a lot of different outfits. I'm not sure. She died recently, and in fact, I talked to her about a few months before she died, and we were going to have lunch, but it never happened.
Right. Well, let's go back to Parkland for a minute after you took this picture. As you mentioned earlier, you did capture one of the very few pictures that show Mrs. Kennedy actually leaving the hospital. You can see her there, her head just above the ambulance there. Her husband's casket is in the ambulance, and they are headed back to Love Field. Now, you got a chance to see Mrs. Kennedy, and you saw the blood on her dress. Tell us about that.
It was just, it was a pink dress, it was splattered with blood, yeah. Unfortunately, they wouldn't let us in any closer, and I didn't have, if I'd had a longer lens with me, I probably could have got a better shot, but you just had to work with what you had, and that was it.
Now, you're a young man, you're supposed to be just covering the president's visit, and suddenly the president's dead. And you are now swept up in the biggest story of the 20th century. What's going through your mind, both professionally, but also just as a person, knowing that the president has just died?
Well, I think we were all in a state of shock. For days, I barely got any sleep. I was at the newspaper. Right after Parkland, I was over on Zang's Boulevard in Oak Cliff, where they'd rounded up Lee Harvey Oswald. Unfortunately, they just left a few minutes before we got there. And then I was back at Parkland, and I was back at Love Field again, trying to get on board Air Force One to get a shot of the sign again in color.
You guys saw the famous picture downstairs of Lyndon Johnson being sworn in as the new president? Okay. Eamon was right outside the plane.
I was right at the bottom of the gangplank trying to talk my way on
with
board.
color film, and they would not let him on board the plane.
National Geographic called me. They wanted that picture so bad. I don't know why they would want it, but
I don't know.
anyway, they wouldn't let me on, so we never got that.
Well, that really is a shame, because it would have been great to see that scene in color. Now, President Kennedy wasn't the only victim. On November 22nd, a Dallas police officer named J.D. Tippit was also shot and killed. And this is a picture, Eamon, that you took of Tippit's widow and his three children.
Yeah,
Alan on the far right, and then the little boy is Curtis, and on the end there is daughter Brenda. And what was it like to photograph the Tippits? I mean, of course, these kids have just lost their dad, and Marie Tippit has just lost her husband. I imagine it was a very somber occasion.
Well, you could tell by just looking at their faces that it was pretty somber and sad and unfortunate. And you know, but it's one of those things that happened, and you can't undo it.
And this is at their home?
Yes.
Okay. Let's move on to Sunday, because on Sunday, of course, Lee Harvey Oswald is being transferred from the city jail to the Dallas County Jail. Now, Eamon, originally you had...
No, Saturday.
Well, Oswald was shot on Sunday, though, and that's what we're talking about, is the shooting. Friday was the assassination, Saturday, and then Sunday was the transfer of Oswald.
Okay.
Okay, it doesn't matter.
Yeah, it's been so long.
That's fine. You've slept a few times since then, hopefully caught up on your sleep from the weekend
Almost.
of the assassination. All right, so here is, of course, this famous photograph, which I mentioned Bob Jackson earlier. We saw him in that picture at Parkland. He took this picture of Oswald being shot. And Eamon, originally, you were supposed to be in the basement that day. Tell us about your assignment.
Well, Bob and I were assigned to cover this event. And basically, I was supposed to go to the police station. And I got thinking about it, and Bob was supposed to go down to the courthouse, the jail. And I got thinking about it the night before, and I called Bob. Bob and I shared a darkroom together, so we socialized. We were very close. But I called Bob and I said, if you want to swap, I said, because I knew he liked to play golf or something, or do something on Sundays. But I figured there'd be better pictures down at the jail. They're going to parade him around. There's going to be mug shots, fingerprints. So anyway, we swapped. So I'm down at the jail, and Jackson is at the police station, and he got the Pulitzer Prize. So that's not to say that if I was there, I would have got the same shot. I may have missed it completely.
Or yours might have been even better. You never know.
We just can't tell, because no one knows.
But you were down here at the county jail, which is actually right outside these windows here. In fact, this next picture shows the crowd, and the guy's waving his cowboy hat in the air, and people are happy. And what are they reacting to?
They're celebrating the shooting of Oswald.
These folks are celebrating Jack Ruby shooting Lee Harvey Oswald. This really gives you a sense of the mood of the city at that time. People were so angry at Lee Harvey Oswald because he had been accused of shooting President Kennedy, and then for a Dallas nightclub owner like Jack Ruby to just step out and shoot Oswald, rather than being horrified, these people were actually cheering, and this man waving his hat in the air. You can see the Texas School Book Depository there on the right edge of the picture. This was taken right outside here by the Dallas County Jail. Now, from this area out here by the jail, once you heard Oswald had been shot, you went right back to Parkland.
Back at Parkland again, yeah.
And you took some pictures out there, including a picture of Oswald's body being wheeled down a hallway.
Right.
Tell us about the scene at Parkland 2 days after Kennedy was there, when Oswald was being treated.
There was certainly no one crying about the death of Oswald out there. You know, there was no spectators. It was much less of an event.
And you were able to get inside the hospital this time.
Yeah, I wasn't supposed to be in there,
but you managed to find your way in.
Exactly.
Right. All right, well, let's jump ahead. The man who shot Lee Harvey Oswald that day was this man, Jack Ruby. And this is a very unusual picture of Ruby. How did this come about?
I covered the whole trial. It went on for months, but this was a noontime assignment, and they were taking him out to for psychiatric evaluation. So he was on a loading dock, and there was not too many people covering this, which I thought was strange. But I did get this shot, and he doesn't look quite with it. And I turned it in to the city desk at Dallas Times Herald, and they said, well, we had a directive from the managing editor. He doesn't want to see any more Jack Ruby pictures for at least a week. So I said, well, but they agreed it was a stunning shot. The rest of it you can't see, but he had his hands and the handcuffs in the foreground. So I FedExed it to Life magazine. They used it 2 pages. And then it went 2 pages in every major magazine around the world with the cut line on it, "Is this man sane?" which was the whole point of the trial. But in this picture, he didn't look quite sane. So.
Right. And we have a couple of pictures you took during the trial. Here's Ruby surrounded by reporters talking. Did you get a sense of what kind of guy Jack Ruby was?
Well, I'd met Jack Ruby before before he shot Oswald. He used to hang out at the newspaper and at the police station. But I didn't know him, but I recognized who he was.
What kind of a reputation did he have?
It's kind of a little bit on the sleazy side, I'd say. You know, he ran a kind of a strip club, and I think the Dallas police used to go there frequently, not to make arrests, but for entertainment.
This picture shows Ruby surrounded by deputy sheriffs, and this was sort of 1960s security during the trial. Basically, these deputy sheriffs would just put their hands on each other's shoulders to form a human barricade to sort of protect Ruby, to make sure no one did what Ruby did, jump out and shoot him during the course of his trial. You weren't allowed in the courtroom during the actual trial except on the day of the verdict. So what would you do to fill up your time standing out in the hallway outside the courtroom? We
would just swap war stories with other reporters and try and kill the time. Occasionally, there was a glass door you could, and they tried to keep you away from it, but occasionally we could get a shot through the glass. It wasn't great. They did let us in to photograph the jury and the judge.
And we're about to see a picture here of Jack Ruby's 2 attorneys. The man in the dark suit right there is a man named Melvin Bella, who was a lawyer in San Francisco, right there. And also another Jack Ruby attorney was Joe Tonahill here in the light-colored suit. We're not sure why all the people in this picture have milk cartons. It was clearly lunchtime. But what did you think of Melvin Bella? He was kind of a colorful, flamboyant character.
Very flamboyant. And I can't figure out why they're all drinking chocolate milk. It must have been the thing to do at the time.
I don't know. It looks like an advertisement for milk there. But you frame this picture so nicely, because if you look closely, there's the 6th floor window, the southeast corner of the school book depository, and you did that deliberately.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
That's fantastic. And Melvin Bella was a very colorful person, and we're going to see another great picture of him. Look at this picture. Yeah.
That was Melvin Bella's reaction when the jury returned a guilty verdict.
Yeah. Jack Ruby was found guilty of shooting.
He was not happy about it.
Yeah. Ruby was found guilty of murder with malice for shooting Lee Harvey Oswald. And as you can see, this is the way his attorney, Melvin Bella, reacted. In this lengthy tirade against the city, Melvin Bella said that Dallas was a city of shame, and the people of Dallas should be ashamed of themselves. This has been called the trial of the century, this grand media spectacle. Now, you were there covering it primarily for the Herald. I mean, you were doing it almost every day.
Every day.
Would you say that, in retrospect, that this was the trial of the century?
Probably. Yeah. It was. It got to be the same thing every day, and that was one of the reasons that the managing editor of the paper, we used to run pictures of Jack Ruby every day. He got tired of looking at it, and that's why they didn't use that particular. The defining picture, they turned that one down.
Right.
But they used these other kind of pictures, until they got tired of looking at them. But it was, we had a lot of media there from all over the world. There was photographers everywhere, reporters.
Well, the last image we're going to look at is actually a modern one taken right here in this space just a few months ago. We had a reunion of photographers, and as you can see, there's Eamon Kennedy right here in the middle, and we have three of his fellow photographers, William Allen, Bob Jackson again that we saw earlier, and then over there on the corner is Daryl Hikus, and then that's John Sparks, a local reporter and broadcaster who moderated a panel discussion. Now, Eamon, what was it like 50 years later to be brought back together with your colleagues from the Times Herald and look through your pictures?
Well, the strange thing about it didn't seem like it was 50 years. I hadn't seen any of those people in decades. But when we got together, it was like time had, it was like it was probably a few months ago. No one had really changed that much except getting older.
And on the occasion of this program, Eamon donated to our museum more than 1,200 pictures that he had taken during the course of the Kennedy assassination, the Jack Ruby trial. Great, great enhancement to our photographic record, and we're so honored to have the Eamon Kennedy collection at the museum. Many of the pictures you saw today come from that very generous donation that he made to us. I want to give you guys a chance to be historians for a moment and ask Eamon some questions about the weekend of the assassination, about his thoughts on Oswald or Jack Ruby. So the next 10 or 15 minutes, this will be your chance to ask some questions. If you'll raise your hand, we'll just want to make sure the question's repeated into the microphone so that we can capture it on our recording. Yes, sir.
I know that there's a lot of speculation on what actually happened to John F. Kennedy, like if there was a conspiracy going on and stuff. What do you think happened?
Question was, do you think that there was a conspiracy? I just want to repeat it for the camera.
I personally don't believe it was a conspiracy. I tend to go with what the Warren Commission came up with, that Lee Harvey Oswald was a lone operator.
Now, to second that with a little follow-up question, why do you think Jack Ruby shot Oswald?
Jack Ruby was a huge Kennedy fan, and I think he just tried to short-circuit the whole system of law and order and just take the law into his own hands and put everything right in his mind.
Yes.
So you took a lot of amazing and important photographs that were published all over the country, as you said. If you had to choose just one of the photographs that you took during that whole period of time, which do you think most defined the feeling around the country and in Dallas at the time of the shooting of President Kennedy, and the feeling of everyone as events continue to unfold?
It's a great question.
It is a good question. I think probably the pictures of the crowd, not so much at Love Field, but the crowd at Parkland Hospital, in the parking lot. The pictures of people crying and being distraught.
The picture of the little girl praying, Cathy Atkinson, when it ran in the Times Herald, the cut line was "Grief of a Nation."
Grief of a Nation.
Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
So how did these photos change your career?
Good. How did these pictures covering this news story, how did it change your career?
It's a good question. I'm not sure how to answer it. My career went on. We covered other stories. I left the Dallas Times Herald in 1964, and I went to work for the Miami Herald for until 68. So I was down there for 4 years. Then I came back to the Dallas Times Herald, but it certainly affected me personally, and it affected one of the things I traveled doing commercial annual report photography around the world quite a bit. But when I was introduced as Mr. Kennedy from Dallas, plus I looked like one of them, I had to answer a lot of questions everywhere I went, and about that.
Yes, sir, in the bow tie there.
So, I was reading downstairs about the bullet that went through Mr. Kennedy and then entered Governor Connolly's, like, here, then went through there, then went through 5.
Right.
It's like, what's your theory on that?
The single bullet theory, Kennedy and Connolly. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, not really. Who really knows what happened? I know they call it the magic bullet, and there's a lot of people who were not there who've written books about this thing. So I just don't know.
Okay. And gentleman next to you, yes.
After the whole experience of the assassination and taking all these photographs, has this changed your photography, or are you still a photographer?
Yeah, has this changed the way you work as a photographer, and are you still a photographer today?
I'm still a photographer. When I got out of the newspaper and magazine business, I did basically annual reports, which are for Fortune 500 companies for quite a few years. I also did other things, architectural, fashion, and I retired some years ago. But I'm still doing photography as an art form, and have a website, and produce work both on film and digitally now.
And give us a sense of, since you grew up and trained using film, do you prefer film, or do you think digital is the way to go?
I prefer film for black and white, but for color, I think digital is probably way superior.
Yes, ma'am.
What was your reaction when you heard that President Kennedy was shot?
I was absolutely astounded. We were just floored. At first it was disbelief. We didn't believe it until we got on the phone and called the city desk and found out that it actually had happened. Yeah, I was amazed.
Back there in the back row. What other major events have you covered in addition to the assassination?
Well, I covered Kennedy before in Canada. He's a visit to Canada, but I've covered for political events, campaigns, Barry Goldwater, Richard Nixon, Hubert Humphrey.
Lyndon Johnson got mad at
Johnson.
you. Tell that story.
Yeah, he did. It's when he was vice president. He was in a small jet, and it was taxiing out at Love Field, and it had been raining a lot, and there was mud. And it ran off the taxiway and got stuck in the mud. So we went out there and got there very fast. And he was just getting off the plane. They were getting him off the plane, and he was carrying his dry cleaning, and he had his glasses on. And he didn't like to be photographed with his glasses on, so he shouted at me not to take any pictures, and I just kept taking pictures. So anyway, he walked up to me, and he said, "Didn't I tell you not to take pictures of me with my glasses on?" And I said, "Yeah, you did." And he said, "What's your name?" And I said, "Kennedy." So then he thought I was just being smart, and the reporter said, "No, Mr. Vice President, his name really is Kennedy."
You probably could have lost your job over something like that. It's a good thing that didn't happen.
Yeah, I doubt it.
Let's take a question from over here. Yes.
If Kennedy was not shot, do you believe he would have been reelected as president?
Yes, no question about it.
Would you have voted for him in '64?
Yes.
Yes, ma'am.
How do you think he would have reacted if you were actually on the street where he was shot? Do you think he would have been shocked, or do you think he would have reacted quickly and taken some photographs?
On the street?
Yeah, if you had been with a camera out here in Dealey
Actually
Plaza.
shot, where he was
I don't know. It's hard to know how you would react. We had a photographer in the motorcade, and he didn't get anything. The only person that got anything was I think it was a dentist that shot the movie film. Zapruder?
Dress manufacturer.
A dress manufacturer.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
But he was a bystander with a home movie camera.
That's right.
Yeah. Not a professional. Yes, ma'am.
How does your family and friends react to knowing that you had shot this whole story and shot pictures of it?
Family and friends, their reaction.
Well, I didn't see them for several days. I was at the newspaper, so.
So you didn't go home at all?
Yeah, but I went home to change shirts and stuff and
Okay.
went back. It was
Wow.
we were all sleep deprived.
Yeah, right there.
When you covered this Kennedy assassination, was it the most important part of your career, do you think?
As far as photography, or as far as photojournalism went, although back in those days, we weren't called photojournalists, we were just photographers. That's a latter term. But yeah, I think it's the most important story I ever covered, by far.
Yeah, right there.
If you could go back in time to the assassination, would you want to change any of your actions?
If you could go back in time, would you change anything about what you did that day?
Well, hindsight is so accurate. If it would have been more interesting to be down on the grassy knoll outside the window here, but we don't know that in advance, so it's hard to make that kind of determination.
We'll take one final question. Yeah.
Which one was more of a traumatic experience for you? The shooting of JFK or the events of 9/11?
Good question. Which was more traumatic, the Kennedy assassination or September 11th?
Both of these things were devastating, but I think for me, the Kennedy assassination, because I was involved in the whole thing. When 9/11 went down, I was living in San Diego, and it was like a science fiction movie.
Yeah, you were detached from it.
Yeah,
not in the
I was
middle.
too far away from it.
How many of you guys like to take pictures on your iPhones or iPads or electronic devices? Okay.
All of them.
Eamon, if we have any future professional photographers in the audience, what advice, as someone who's been doing this for decades, what would you tell them?
If they're trying to make a career out of it, I'd plan on having some backup kind of job. Just something to make some money in the way, I think it's very competitive now, and not that it wasn't competitive back then, but I was one of the lucky ones. I managed to do what I liked to do and make a living at it, but a lot of people weren't so lucky.
Well, Eamon, I'm so glad you got off the bus that day and decided to stay in Dallas.
I'm still here.
All right. Please join me in thanking Eamon Kennedy for being our guest today.